The OWASP top 10 privacy risks are identified as common threats to the privacy of organization and the integrity of personal information. So these are the 10 that have been identified. Like Christina said, we're doing an information assessment. We want to walk through each one of them, and we want to figure out what are some of the things that commonly lead to the risks, and how can we avoid them? What are some steps we can take to avoid these entering our environment? So to start off with web application vulnerability. So thankfully, the first of the OWASP top 10 literally points to the common OWASP top 10 web application vulnerabilities, and essentially says, refer to that and look at that for avoiding this risk. So making sure that the OWASP top 10 is in your development lifecycle, is in your vulnerability program. The major of the top 10 risks to consider is the exposure of sensitive data, whether or not access control is broken, or if there's insufficient logging and monitoring for the solution. A common pitfalls that we see, informal management typically is where what leads to vulnerability management taking a hit. So not having a formalized program, not having the correct testing parameters, the correct scope, not having the correct ranking, not having acceptance criteria, not having the correct documentation, essentially nothing on paper that really requires your team to seek out any kind of vulnerability assessment of the environment. So to avoid this common risk, we determined that the best course of action, one, is planning. Everything on paper. This is a common theme throughout this webinar, making sure that all of your stuff is on paper. Plan out when you want to do your tests, plan out the scope of them, plan out which applications are hosting sensitive information, plan out if you're going to be doing any external penetration testing, and document everything. And then also part of documentation, once you get all the vulnerabilities, what are you doing with them? So have you defined vulnerability ownership? Have you defined vulnerability acceptance criteria? For example, to what extent do we accept that the vulnerability is just there? Testing. So test applications at scheduled intervals, perform the internal and external testing. This is actually going through and using a Qualys scanner or employing an external party, whatever it might be, test your environment and ensure critical systems are kept up to date. One of the most common vulnerabilities, I believe this is one of the top 10, but outdated software. So making sure that your firmware, your software, your applications, everything's up to date with the latest security patches, latest feature updates, and really the best way to test is with independent critique. So what we mean by independent critique is, of course, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, and I was going to say, absolutely, independent, evaluation. And as part of that independent evaluation, when you perform these tests, it's really around looking at data exfiltration. So for, focusing on privacy aspect of the web application vulnerability and the testing criteria, it needs to add that additional aspect into, can I exfiltrate data out of the web application itself? Can I compromise the code in order to gain access to the data? And so that's the additional test parameter associated with this particular privacy risk. We know that most organizations, if not all, are performing testing against their applications and their web applications themselves. However, the testing criteria can change from organization to organization on what the intent is. You may look for vulnerabilities, you may look for flaws in the code, but not necessarily evaluate for exfiltration of data. And this is really a major intent of this particular item. It does have overlap with some of the other OWASP top 10 privacy risks, but it's to make sure that that testing platform is there to evaluate that. And really when it comes to secure development, kind of, going in there, it's really around, are you enforcing data minimization from the beginning? So for instance, with secure development, it's, you're not calling up all of the data elements stored within a particular database or table, flat file, or what have you, but you're really minimizing the data that you're exposing to the web application to begin with and what those calls are to the backend database. So you're really starting to force data minimization from the secure development aspect, and you're looking at data exfiltration techniques from the testing criteria to begin with.
Yep, absolutely. And just to piggy off what Christina said, going into secure development, Really making sure that the code is tested throughout, like she said. The main thing for secure development, of course, is are your developers trained and are they aware of the correct secure coding principles? We actually don't see this as much as we should for a lot of clients, so it's definitely something to be wary of. And another thing we also see is outside parties. Do you have any outside developers? If you do, what are they doing? What kind of secure coding principles are they following? A vulnerability in an application that comes from a third party, gets into your environment, data is leaked through a vulnerability there, well, that's a privacy risk in your environment, even though it's the result of the third party's negligence. So it's definitely important to make sure that the developers have the correct security training and that the correct security requirements are there, not only internal, but for external developers as well. So data leakage, the second of the privacy risks. So essentially, where is there opportunity for personal information to be accessed or exported without authorization? Common pitfalls for this is definitely access and people. So by access, of course, is there too much access? Are we not doing enough access reviews? Do we do any logging and monitoring of access? For third parties, do we have third-party contractors, third-party systems that are touching certain databases to certain applications? And if so, do they need to be? Again, if you want to minimize data leakage, you minimize data access. You minimize the ports of entry. So, and then people, of course. What are the people risks? Are our employees, are they responsible for any data leakage? You might be surprised to find just that how big that scope is, that yeah, they probably are, because are they sharing things with secure means? Are they sharing personal information, for example, through email? Or are they taking personal information over the phone if it's a call center service, whatever it may be? Is there personal information on paper in their unlock the desks? These are all potential privacy risks that need to be considered. So, and also, of course, endpoints, making sure that your employees' workstations, which are the final point of the network, right? You want to make sure that it's tightened down and that people are not able to export data from these endpoints. The second pitfall, of course, tying into the access, data minimization. So one is not knowing where the data is, not knowing where all personal information is can result in leakage because you don't know what to monitor, not knowing where the stragglers are, and of course, deletion and anonymization. Have we deleted and anonymized enough? The answer is we have excessive personal information that only increases our risk surface. So preventing data leakage. First off, minimization. You can't lose what you don't have, so collect a amount of information to shrink the risk surface. If you can put in automated scrubbing, de-identification, all awesome. Conjunction, you want to do encryption, so even if data is leaked, it's useless. That's the main goal. Limiting access. So tightening down access in the organization for sure will help prevent any sort of data leakage. So minimize access, minimize risk. Ensure you're controlling it at the highest possible levels. If you have, for example, Active Directory, take advantage of group policies, take advantage of restricting access and enforcing policies on workstations. These are all things that you can do to be limiting access for your staff. Also, how can you apply those controls to your third parties? Again, going back to contractors. Does everybody have the right access, accessing in the right method? Do they need that access? So it's very important to be wary of access management in preventing data leakage. And providing for an organization to actually be able to make sure that their employees are doing the right thing, they need to give them a means of doing the right thing. So have you provided your employees with essentially a secure means of sharing personal information? If they don't have something like that, then they still need to get their job done. They'll send it over email. They'll communicate it over Slack or something. So if you can provide some sort of like a box or a secure means of uploading and sharing documentation, and you put it in your policy that employees are required to only share data on such and such approved platforms, then you're in a much better state in terms of liability.
Yeah, and it's also, on that too, looking at, web applications in particular, how do you communicate and transfer data from one party to another, or one application in the organization to another, because we know that all systems these days are pretty much interconnected. So it's really looking at the means of which, you're providing data minimization restrictions around that sharing of information. So looking at how APIs are configured, looking at the APIs themselves and saying, what are they authorized, to go ahead and obtain and transfer to various applications and third parties. That's always a good means to go ahead and evaluate as part of, privacy due diligence when it comes to development, is looking at what the APIs are pulling and sharing. That's usually one of those common things that we look at, but it's usually net new for organizations to think about when it comes to, potential sharing and the minimization of data.
Absolutely. So moving to the next risk. So the next risk is essentially the inability to effectively respond to a breach in terms of privacy, not just in terms of incident management and containment and security, but also what are the privacy requirements of a breach. So what are some of the common pitfalls here? A lack of technical understanding. An organization that doesn't understand where all their personal information is could potentially not be able to understand the breadth of the impact, and therefore not know which data systems were impacted. Was such and such person's information accessed? We wouldn't really understand. Also, the questions to ask: have we protected this data already? Have we taken proactive steps to encrypt it so it's useless once they get it? Have we taken steps to purge it so that even if it is accessed, the least possible amount is taken? Or even anonymization. Are they only collecting aggregate data sets, which are, again, useless? These are all steps that must be considered before you can really say that we can respond to a breach. And monitoring and logging. An organization, of course, would need to understand all the metadata about a breach. So having all that logging and monitoring capability there is very critical. And another pitfall is informalized planning. So we typically will, we'll see lots of incident response plans, but potentially, or not always see in the incident response plans. So you want to ask yourself, do our incident response plans incorporate data protection regulatory requirements as far as specific timelines parties are in this process? These are all things to consider. Again, it's best to, like we said, it's always best to always understand everything to understand the breadth of the impact. So to avoid this risk, understand where personal information is in your environment first off. Have a clear understanding of all personal information. This is really a proactive step, and you've seen it like once or twice already. You'll see it again plenty in this webinar, but data inventory definitely does minimize much of your privacy risk, because once you inventory, you can move to the step of devaluing. Take your information set and purge it. Get rid of unneeded fields, run scripts where you can, encrypt it, make it essentially take the data and make it useless except for the purposes that you need it. Once its value is diminished, then breach repercussions are diminished. And planning ahead. Taking your existing incident response plans and update to reflect specific privacy requirements. Consider who you need to notify, maybe get a running list going of all the parties involved and contact information for all of your critical third parties. Or if you are a processor, then you want to make sure that you have all of your clients somewhere on call, someone to notify in the event of an incident. Again, in terms of breaches, privacy, CCPA, GDPR, they're all about responsibility. It's all about taking responsibility and responsibility going up the chains. Having all this planned out with that. So the deletion is considered a privacy risk. We've talked plenty already about why you want to delete, but just to give it its own time. Why might there be too much information? So the lack of information governance is generally what we see is why there is too much personal information. If you don't have information governance, you wouldn't have more of a succinct data inventorying, and therefore you probably have too much information. So Not having governance could result in excessive amounts of personal information, which of course not only is a risk to personal information, but is also a non-compliance with most privacy laws. So it's kind of a double risk in that sense. So that, of course, that really requires organizations to take a step back and say, do all the data we have, is it necessary, and have we defined the right regulatory steps to collect, maintain, and use the information? And part of the use life cycle is deletion. So making sure deletion is in the life cycle of data is very important for privacy compliance. Another pitfall, of course, is technical means. If there isn't any sort of automated purging and it's all just based off of an individual's desire to go in, then you're probably going to end up with a lot of stragglers. So the lack of technical means of understanding where personal information is and the lack of being able to run automated scripts for all this really does make it a lot more difficult to delete the right information. So to secure data at the end of its life cycle actually requires you to be proactive and plan it out from the beginning. So first off, specific purpose. What's the purpose of you actually needing the data? Every new process needs a PIA and needs a new privacy impact assessment. When you want to do that, you want to define the data lifecycle from start to end, and you want to communicate to the subject for full transparency, and that transparency is coming up as well. You want to disclose for full transparency how long you're going to have it and when's it going to be deleted, who's going to have access to it. Once your privacy notice is built, stick to it. It's a public-facing document. It's good for holding yourself accountable, and it's also good for communicating everything to the consumer. Documentation. So information governance, again, it's nothing we'll talk a lot about. It's its own function, it's its own policy, it's its own team sometimes. It's necessary for clean deletion in your environment. It's really about taking the data lifecycle, taking all the steps of the data lifecycle and making it auditable. That's what you need to be doing in terms of documentation. Are our deletion practices auditable? Have we considered all of the right environments? Have we considered our staff? What we mean there is, does your documentation reflect your staff's responsibility in deleting personal information? So, of course, the number one of the biggest privacy risks in general we see, excessive information on employee workstations, because those are, you have 500 workstations, those are 500 avenues for risk. So definitely be wary about documentation for deletion. And you want to take advantage of automation where you can. There's native tools in Oracle databases, SQL purging. You can write scripts to purge based on the age, based on the parameters, whatever it may be. But where you can, yeah, definitely automate. And where you are automating, make sure that's also supported by some sort of documentation. Again, it's all just making sure you're doing it and you can audit against it later. Cool. So transparency, the reason this is a risk, the risk is a company not being transparent enough. And the issue of not being transparent enough is you might find yourself non-compliant with privacy regulations if you aren't meeting transparency requirements. So the idea is, can you explain in plain English to your subjects exactly what you're doing with their personal information? The pitfalls here, of course, is not understanding what you're doing. If an organization does not conduct PIAs, if they don't have an understanding of what the data is and that they're collecting and what they need it for and how long they need it, then they can't be fully transparent. It requires organizations to have a proactive understanding of their information sets before they can fully be transparent. And again, you want to include sharing, you want to include marketing, and this is all information that should be discussed in the privacy notice, which of course goes to the next point, making it clear. CCPA's privacy policy does have requirements for making it clear, and public transparency per application is how we would recommend the approach to do it. We have clients who have 20, 30 different applications, services, websites. They collect different types of information, but they do have 20, 30 different privacy notices per, because each one has its own data, each one requires its own level of transparency. So to meet transparency, and transparency is actually useful for you because if you seek transparency, you'll hit compliance somewhere in there. They meet, which is nice. To seek transparency, one, determine the purpose. So maintain transparency by documenting all the information you need and what you're doing with it. Avoid excessive data use and excessive data collection, and making sure that this language is communicated to your staff. So does your staff understand the acceptable use of personal information? Does your marketing team know when they can share personal information or not, for example? These are all things to be considered. Compliance. So information governance should consider compliance requirements. Transparency is a component of many of these regulations, so including that step into the information governance would help secure transparency for the organization. And third-party compliance. So part of transparency with, for example, CCPA about documenting the third parties you work with, part of the transparency there is having an understanding of all of your third parties, managing vendors from the highest levels, and documenting the kind of data they get. Once you understand how your vendors are doing everything, then you can much more easily write up your privacy notices that talk about which vendors are accessing so-and-so systems. Okay, so purpose and use. The idea here is that data is being collected and used for a purpose or a use that is not what the subject agreed to. The pitfalls here is a lack of documentation, definitely. You don't have on paper what you need, you don't have on paper why you need it and what you're doing with it. The developers might need something, but then the designers determine something else and marketing determines something else. So you want to make sure that there's a concise understanding of all the data being collected. And another pitfall, of course, is not providing the subject the right to opt out. So make sure when you're giving your subject their notice of all the data collection, tell them why you're doing it, give them all of their rights, and understand consent. Definitely you want to understand consent as it applies, as it's defined in various privacy laws. And of course, definitely a cultural issue could be a cause for this as well. We've talked to plenty of clients who will say, oh, we have a mindset of collect as much, or collect as much as we can. Get it into your corporate culture that the correct method is to collect as little as possible. That would definitely save you a lot of headache down the line. And a lack of anonymization could also potentially lead to difficulty in purpose and use. If you have data for a long time, under GDPR, under CPRA, the retaining of personal information for longer than it's needed violates its purpose and use. So have we anonymized? Have we purged? Is the data we have just sitting around, is it necessary for anything? These are also common pitfalls that result in that could result in this risk. So to avoid this, to ensure that information is only used for specific purposes, access and permission. So putting barriers of entry to limit the information, to limit unwarranted use, requiring formal approval for all new processing activities. So that also is important to making sure that you understand what data is being used per activity. And are we documenting connections? Are our connections all secured? Anonymization is a step that could be taken for analytics, research, other purposes. Use anonymized information, use aggregate information. There's tools for this. They're iffy. We haven't seen one that we love, but of course, we've seen methods with various clients of script running or deleting fields, whatever it may be. All of this does lower the risk of de-identification or lowers the risk of re-identification, and therefore could help prevent from any purpose and use violations. All right.
Cool. So one thing I would add on this is, just the monitoring component. A good thing to integrate these reviews and be able to monitor, what changes are being done in the organization and what's, taking place is to maybe implement a privacy check within the change control process when it comes to purpose and use of data. So obviously, as applications change, as needs change in the organization, it doesn't necessarily go through formal means like, a privacy review, say through a marketing campaign or anything like that, or changes to applications, but it would go through change control. And so within that change control process, privacy has an opportunity to evaluate the data change as part of that change to the application itself. And so it could be used as a good check and balance in order to validate data monitoring and have an opportunity to evaluate and a check-in whether that data should be collected or not, and do that due diligence at that time before it goes live into production, and then having to look at pulling it back, because it's only going to frustrate people in the organization to do those development activities, implement it, have it in production, and then have to pull it back out after the business is used to collecting that data and leveraging it anyway. And so it's definitely a good check and balance to have privacy as part of that change control process to evaluate that data usage.
Yep, absolutely. Agreed. And it's also hugely beneficial in the development life cycle as well by doing so. So definitely agreed. Cool. So moving on to the next one. The next risk is excessive sharing with third parties, which is a lot more common than you might think. The common pitfalls is a lack of monitoring. So we talked about it before. If you're not overseeing your vendors from a global level, from the highest possible level, and you have a good view into everything, then it's going to be an issue going down the line when you're unsure of exactly what type of information a vendor has, especially in terms of a breach. It's a headache. Also, you want to be wary of widgets, cookies, outside libraries that you're using, whatever it might be. Sometimes these are also sending excessive information. So, and we also see documentation not being strengthened to include privacy and security language quite a bit. So this is a huge thing for third parties, that if a third party doesn't have the correct security language, correct privacy language, doesn't have the correct data usage language, if you don't sign a data processing agreement that says exactly what data you're sharing, then you're opening yourself up to the opportunity of excessive sharing of personal information. And it's important to remember that it's always the responsibility of the controller to ensure that that the third party is complying. So that said, to avoid costly vendor breaches, agreements is step one. So standard agreements, standard data processing agreements, all vendors should be held to the same security standard as their clients. You can only do so much. So establish responsibility in your documentation, establish that XYZ client agrees to uphold certain security standards as part of the agreement and protect data and purge data according to your defined standards. Having it on paper is definitely a very powerful tool to avoid liability. Verification. So it is the responsibility of controllers to verify that the vendor process or the vendor is secure from procurement to the end of the life cycle. So this means being involved in the procurement process, making sure that it's centralized, so you're not getting any duplicate vendors, you're not getting any vendors doing the same thing or whatever it might be, you're not wasting money. Making sure that the testing is something that is handled, again, at a high level, so you know which vendors have been tested, who hasn't been tested, the extent that they're tested, and monitoring, constant monitoring of any vendor services, vendor data sharing practices, collections. Essentially, just everything you can do in a successful third-party security program to make sure that the vendor is meeting your security and privacy standards. That said, privacy. You want to consider how are the vendors approaching privacy, because a privacy breach in their environment is a privacy breach for you. So include this in your security process. If the vendor is doing GDPR, for example, ask them about GDPR, ask them about do you have like a GDPR white paper? What's your process for data subject requests? If we give you 100 data subject requests, can you meet them? These are all questions that you should be asking to make sure that you're not going to be guilty of a privacy violation because of your vendor's negligence. So the specific risk here is about outdated personal information. I expanded it a bit just to make it about overall ensuring data accuracy. So this is something that is in GDPR. It's in pretty much every privacy law. It's always the requirement of the organization. If you want to collect data for somebody, you need to make sure that it's accurate, unless of course it's a service they're sharing themselves, in which case then they're required to make sure their data is accurate. Common pitfalls, of course, is a lack of automated data inventory. So if you don't have automated inventorying, if you don't have a good understanding of where everything is, and you might have old data somewhere, you might have older databases, these are potentially inaccurate. I mean, some of the methods we've seen of combating this is actually just removing things based on age. So you want to make sure you're getting rid of old data where you can. A lack of governance is also a huge issue, kind of like we talked about deletion. Not having accuracy, data accuracy built into your information governance process could result in eventually you find there's no accuracy checks, there's no health checks, which eventually could lead to outdated information sets, which are both a privacy violation and not hugely beneficial to you. So to avoid, again, goes back into governance. Information governance should have accuracy checks in there. So those accuracy checks include manual reviews, source checks, and purging, all of which, again, do the purging based off of old information should be the best approach. Once it's on paper, try to automate where you can. So giving a simple, take data inventories, and any automation in this process of data inventorying would be much easier if you have a clear view of all the information in your corporate environment. You can much more easily attack the issue of data accuracy. So taking advantage of automated data inventories and that good view that you have will help you understand how to set up purging and accuracy goals. And maintaining integrity is absolutely, again, the risk talks about outdated information, but we took it a step further and talked about accuracy because that's what the laws all talk about. Integrity, 100%, is making sure that your sources are all good, making sure that the integrity of the data itself is good routinely. You can use scripts and hash functions to remove unneeded data. And you're also considering monitoring, considering access, and considering who's able to access critical databases, critical data stores, and if they do, what kind of permissions do they have, and are we monitoring and seeing what they're doing while they're in there? So maintaining data integrity is critical to maintaining data accuracy, absolutely. So this is a brief one. This is thankfully a brief one. Session expiration, essentially the risk here is your user connections are inactive for such and such period. Why isn't the user timed out? So the issue here, of course, usually it's identity management. Maybe there isn't a built-out identity management process. Maybe there isn't a way for us to identify that the user needs to be timed out after such and such time for a system. And it's also something we're wary of is data sharing and monitoring. So any data sharing that we're doing over the connection, just making sure that that's a secure connection as well. That said, just simple steps to avoid this. One is to any kind of automated lockouts that you can do, configure applications and remote connections to disconnect after specific periods of time. Try to make it as short as possible to minimize the attack window. And educate your team, your organization. While it's tempting to remain logged in, save passwords, write them down, whatever it might be, educate them that best practice is to re-authenticate using MFA with VPN, and where possible, if you can do a single sign-on, if If you can just remove this whole nuisance from your employees, that's even better. Okay. And I believe this is the last of the risks, but a lack of transfer security. So what we're talking about here, of course, is encryption in transit. What are the issues here? So one, enforcing encryption. Are we enforcing encryption for all of our connections? Are we enforcing encryption for emails, for email connections? Any kind of deprecated old systems that we have, they might be connecting with SSL or older protocols. Do we need these? If there are older connections, how can we minimize the risk there? So protecting data in transit. First step, like many things, document everything, document the need for all the connections, for the services, for third-party connections, applications, and consider your employees. How are your employees sharing information? Are they sharing anything on public networks? If so, are they doing so through encrypted means, through a VPN? Are they using an encrypted file share like we talked about earlier? It's definitely important to make sure that everything is documented and that your employees know the best practice for sharing information. Once that's said and done, actually go and encrypt everything. So you want to enforce encryption from the enforce high standards from your vendors. You want to require TLS encryption, non-opportunistic, enforce it where you can, and enforce encryption at rest for email, and wherever you can, email security in general. Email is a huge risk that we see, so if you can encrypt emails at rest and in transit would be even better. And consider your file share servers and file share services. So third-party file shares, file share service, FTPs or anything, how are those secured? Who owns those? Are you securing them or are they encrypted? These are all questions to ask. So making sure that all communication channels are encrypted is definitely critical. And data loss prevention. A DLP tool is massively beneficial to preventing data leakage like we talked about earlier, but also to protecting data in transit, prevent exfiltration at the start, and detect and handle the unauthorized requests. Also beneficial is you're maintaining the log information from the DLP and you're defining the conditions to properly access the environment. So the role of a DLP in protecting data in transit is certainly important. Perfect. So that was essentially the run through, but those are the top 10 risks and how to avoid them. And I think at this point, Christina, we're opening it up to just Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been monitoring, the questions in the chat and everything like that throughout the session, and that's where I've been jumping in to answer, to provide additional context so we can answer them as we went along. I know one of the questions was, how do organizations, implement something like this or monitor, to the OWASP top 10 privacy risks. Organizations have implemented OWASP top 10 within their development process and some of their other, technical processes for application development and security risk assessments, et cetera. But how can you do that for the OWASP top 10 privacy risks? And it's really the same thing. So to answer the question directly, we see success in part of the risk assessment methodology, so privacy risk analysis, to include this as one of the standards that you evaluate against, so that way you can look at the technical components of web application and the privacy implications that web applications need to be developed to, and the technical controls surrounding them to support privacy. And so if you do that, what happens is it becomes more of a seamless process to evaluate these in your organization, just to embed them within your privacy risk assessment process. So that's, pretty successful to be performed there. But yeah, I think that was the only outstanding question that we needed to go ahead and address. And so with that, I know we wanted to go ahead and enforce, like if you have any questions about privacy, if you're looking at any, comparisons between all the different privacy laws, we do have a privacy tracker that is made available to everyone for free. So check the Tevora website for the exact link and everything for the privacy tracker. It's under our resource section of the website. And then we have a couple of upcoming webinars that we're going to be doing over the next month or two. So please stay tuned for that on, cloud penetration testing, CMMC, and also high trust. So stay tuned for those within April and May. And with that, if anybody has any questions later on down the road, feel free and contact Adorial or myself. You can email us if you want to go to that slide, Adorial. You can email us directly, and we can go ahead and answer any questions that you all potentially have. So with that, thank you everybody for attending today's session. Again, reach out if you have any questions, post-webinar. And we will be sending out these slides and also a link of the recorded session as well. So thank you everybody for attending.